The chronometer on the dashboard of the F-15E Strike Eagle rolls over to exactly 3:14 a.m. In the freezing darkness over the jagged peaks of western Iran, the B-1 bridge, a colossal feat of engineering and the tallest transit span in the Middle East, is about to undergo what military structural engineers clinically refer to as a total structural divorce from the Earth. A GBU-31 Joint Direct Attack munition, a 2,000-pound piece of American-made precision ordnance, is plummeting through the thin, cold night air at 650 miles per hour. This is not just a bomb, it is a kinetic spear. Its hardened steel nose, forged specifically with advanced metallurgy to punch through meters of reinforced concrete without deforming, impacts the primary support pylon of the bridge with the localized force of a controlled earthquake. But the weapon does not detonate immediately. The FMU-143 delayed action fuse in the tail is a marvel of mathematical timing, designed specifically to let the immense kinetic weight of the weapon penetrate first. It drives 3 full feet deep into the reinforced steel-woven heart of the pylon before the fuse triggers the catastrophic chemical reaction. In a microsecond, 900 pounds of tritonal high explosive is converted into a supersonic pressure wave. The explosion does not merely crack the concrete, it absolutely pulverizes it. It turns decades of structural integrity into a blinding cloud of fine gray dust in a fraction of a second. The thick steel rebar, engineered to hold thousands of tons of tension and compression, snaps instantly like dry winter twigs. The roadway above, a massive 2,000-foot concrete span that just moments ago carried heavy military armor and logistics convoys between Tehran and the western city of Karaj, suddenly loses its foundation. It becomes a massive, terrifying whip, undulating violently under the unforgiving force of gravity before the massive expansion joints shear off completely. 2 civilian vehicles happen to be crossing the span in the dead of night when the supports vanish beneath them. They are tossed into the black, yawning gorge below like cheap plastic toys thrown by an angry child. The massive slab of roadway accelerates toward the valley floor at 32 feet per second squared, and when thousands of tons of concrete and steel finally hit the bottom of the ravine, the sheer kinetic impact registers as a massive seismic event on geological sensors across 3 neighboring countries. In the blink of an eye, the primary logistics umbilical cord connecting the Iranian capital to its western military reinforcements is utterly severed. But this catastrophic destruction was not a standalone strike. It was merely the first kinetic heartbeat of a highly classified, massively coordinated joint United States and Israeli strike package designed to completely paralyze the Iranian military heartland before a single surface-to-air radar dish could even rotate toward the threat. The operation had actually begun over 2 hours before the bridge fell. Launching from blacked-out airbases and aircraft carriers cruising silently in the Persian Gulf, the strike package pushed across the Iranian border at exactly 15,000 feet. They flew a terrifyingly complex route meticulously mapped by satellites to exploit the natural radar shadows created by the towering peaks of the Zagros Mountains. Leading the vanguard of this massive aerial armada were 4 Israeli F-35I Adir stealth fighters. These 5th-generation aircraft do not just fly, they function as the supreme project managers of the entire modern kill chain. Their advanced sensor suites are seamlessly fused into a single encrypted network that actively maps the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps' air defense grid in absolute real time. The F-35I has a radar cross-section roughly the size of a golf ball, yet it is moving through the night sky at 600 knots. Its onboard computers are processing millions of lines of code per second, constantly assigning targeting tasks, perfectly identifying the exact operating frequencies of Iranian S-300 and S-400 radar dishes below, and preparing to surgically remove the bottleneck of the enemy's early warning systems. Trailing closely behind the stealth vanguard in the pitch-black sky were 4 United States Air Force F-15E Strike Eagles, heavy with a massive payload of ordnance and pushing through the atmosphere at Mach 1.2, roughly 920 miles per hour. At this tremendous speed, the sheer friction of the air molecules violently parting around the airframe creates immense thermal stress, heating the leading edges of the wings to scorching temperatures. Inside the cockpits, the crews were running completely dark and silent. There was no unnecessary radio chatter. There were no active radar emissions. They were ghosts carrying hellfire. But the Iranian military was not dormant. Their passive infrared search and track systems, heavily upgraded and networked across the mountain ranges, were desperately scanning the dark horizon for thermal wakes, looking for the telltale heat signatures left by high-speed twin-engine jets cutting through the freezing high-altitude air. This is the brutal difference between an amateur defense network and a professional lethal kill chain. The IRGC operators on the ground did not need to emit active radar pulses to know that something terrible was coming for them. They were simply waiting for the betrayed expectation, waiting for the precise moment the American strike package had to commit to a target and finally reveal its hand. At exactly 3:14 a.m., perfectly synchronized with the bridge strike, the first AGM-158 JSM cruise missile was released from the wing of an F-15E Strike Eagle from a standoff range of 50 miles. Dropping from the pylon, the missile deployed its wings and ignited its turbofan engine. The missile is an aerodynamic ghost, shaped precisely to deflect hostile radar waves and coated in highly classified radar-absorbent materials. It skimmed the rugged mountainous terrain at 550 miles per hour, flying just above the treetops. It used its advanced infrared seeker in its nose to constantly match the terrain below against a preloaded, highly classified 3D map of the Earth, hunting for its target with terrifying autonomous intelligence. Simultaneous to the chaos unfolding in the West, the second phase of this massive operation slammed into central Iran. This was the brutal logic of the dilemma. The American and Israeli strike package hit multiple high-value targets across the nation at the exact same moment, forcing the Iranian high command into a state of total paralysis, forcing them to choose exactly where to send their heavily limited quick-reaction interceptor forces. The primary targets in the central province of Isfahan were the massive oil and natural gas processing facilities, the literal financial heart and economic engine of the regime. The weapon of choice for this devastating surgical strike was the GBU-39 small-diameter bomb. Operating with total impunity in the black sky above, an F-35I Adir opened its internal weapon bays and released a staggering 16 of these precision munitions in a single devastating shotgun volley. The small-diameter bombs deployed their diamondback glide wings and silently sailed through the cold desert air. They covered dozens of miles of horizontal distance without a single engine sound, maintaining absolute pinpoint precision using military-grade GPS and inertial navigation. They slammed into the sprawling refinery storage tanks in a perfectly synchronized, horrifying sequence. The kinetic impact of the hardened tungsten noses pierced the thick steel walls of the holding tanks effortlessly, followed a microsecond later by a delayed detonation that instantly ignited hundreds of thousands of gallons of highly volatile, high-octane aviation fuel. The result was a catastrophic thermal event so incredibly intense that the sheer radiant heat melted the asphalt on civilian highways 3 miles away. The night sky over Isfahan was instantly turned a violently bright orange as massive roiling fireballs rose thousands of feet into the atmosphere, a man-made inferno so massive it was clearly visible to early warning meteorological satellites orbiting 22,000 miles above the surface of the Earth. But as the United States Air Force F-15E Strike Eagles rolled hard and turned for their exit vector, hitting their afterburners to accelerate to Mach 1.4, nearly 1,070 miles per hour, the IRGC's newly developed, highly classified Advanced Aerospace Defense System finally bit back. This was the lethal variable that no one in the Pentagon planning rooms had anticipated. Hidden deep inside a natural gorge in the Zagros mountain range, a highly elite Iranian air defense unit had been operating in strict passive mode for hours, maintaining total electronic silence, patiently waiting for a pure optical or thermal lock. They had waited for the exact moment the American strike package committed to its exit vector and showed the blazing heat of their exhaust nozzles. Inside the cockpit of the trailing F-15E, the pilot's radar warning receiver went instantly from a quiet green screen to a blinding flashing red, emitting a deafening continuous wave tone that screamed through the pilot's helmet headset. The surface-to-air missile was already off the rail and in the air, burning hard toward them at Mach 3. The pilot instinctively slammed the control stick hard over and initiated a brutal 9G brake turn. It is a violent, desperate maneuver that instantly puts 9 times the force of Earth's gravity on the fragile human body, crushing the pilot into his seat, instantly draining the blood from his brain and turning the blood in his veins into heavy lead. His G-suit inflated with bone-crushing pressure to keep him conscious. He slammed the countermeasures button, dumping massive bundles of radar-reflecting chaff and blindingly hot magnesium flares into the night sky, hoping to spoof the missile's electronic brain. But the incoming Iranian missile was an advanced dual-seeker variant. It utilized highly sophisticated logic gates to instantly ignore the burning flares, bypassing the decoys and locking purely onto the massive blazing thermal wake of the Strike Eagle's 2 colossal Pratt & Whitney engines. The missile did not need a direct hit. The proximity fuse triggered exactly 10 feet from the aircraft's rear tail fin. The massive kinetic explosion generated a cloud of expanding titanium shrapnel that violently shredded the Eagle's delicate hydraulic lines and completely severed the left engine's primary fuel manifold. In a single heartbeat, a $100 million apex predator of the skies was instantly converted into a violently unguided, uncontrollable ball of fire hurtling toward the Earth. The IRGC had just proven to the world that they could find the golf ball moving at 600 knots in the dark. As the cockpit filled with blinding smoke and screaming alarms, the pilot managed to reach down and pull the yellow and black ejection handles. The explosive bolts blew the canopy away, and the ACES-2 ejection seats rocketed the pilot and the weapons systems officer out of the doomed aircraft into the freezing, violently rushing air at 400 miles per hour. Below them, their dying aircraft impacted the side of a Khuzestan mountain, detonating its remaining jet fuel and creating a smoldering crater 30 feet deep in the solid rock. The pilot and the WSO were separated in the violent wind blast, their parachutes deployed in the freezing dark. The pilot survived the landing, fracturing his leg on the rocks. But the weapons systems officer went missing, drifting away into the thick clouds of smoke and low-hanging fog near the unforgiving terrain of the Strait of Hormuz. In an instant, the meticulously planned strike mission had brutally transformed into a desperate, terrifying struggle for human survival. Meanwhile, a massive geopolitical shockwave was already rippling across the globe. Iran's kinetic response was absolutely not limited to its own borders. Within minutes of the B-1 bridge collapsing and the refineries burning, the highest levels of the IRGC command initiated a massive, pre-planned, and highly coordinated regional escalation. Underground silo doors slid open across the Iranian plateau. Deep beneath the mountains, solid-fueled ballistic missiles roared to life. According to immediate emergency reports flashing across global news networks, Iran launched a massive simultaneous ballistic and cruise missile barrage targeting critical energy infrastructure in neighboring Gulf countries and firing directly into the heavily contested regional maritime zones. This was not a blind lash-out, it was a coldly calculated strategic move designed to completely roil global energy markets, instantly spike the price of crude oil, and severely disrupt the world's fragile supply of oil and natural gas. Simultaneously, air raid sirens began screaming in Tel Aviv. The Mediterranean sky was violently shattered by a massive cluster bomb attack. Streaks of fire painted the clouds as Israel's Iron Dome and David's Sling interceptor networks worked furiously to stop the incoming deluge, but the sheer volume of the Iranian barrage overwhelmed the system. Submunitions leaked through the defensive umbrella, blanketing commercial districts in a high-density grid of explosive fire. The IRGC was loudly demonstrating to Washington and the world that the American strike on their soil would absolutely not be an isolated incident, but rather the hard trigger for a catastrophic regional firestorm that would push global stability to a terrifying breaking point. Back in the skies over the Persian Gulf, the situation was deteriorating rapidly. An American A-10 Thunderbolt II, affectionately known as the Warthog, had been assigned to the maritime flank of the operation, providing low-level armed overwatch and acting as a lethal diversion. But it was suddenly caught in a horrifyingly high-density ground fire environment. The A-10 Warthog is a legendary machine built around a massive 1,200-pound titanium bathtub that completely encases and protects the pilot from ground fire. But in modern warfare, no armor is absolute. The pilot was flying dangerously low, skimming the dark waters at 200 feet and 350 miles per hour, aggressively engaging swarms of fast-moving Iranian coastal patrol boats with his massive 30mm GAU-8 Avenger rotary cannon. When the pilot pulled the trigger, the gun let out a terrifying mechanical roar that tore through the air and could be heard echoing for miles across the water. The massive depleted uranium 30mm rounds tore from the barrels at supersonic speeds, punching completely through the reinforced steel hulls of the Iranian patrol boats as easily as a fist punches through wet drywall. The boats were reduced to sinking, burning wreckage in seconds. But the Iranian coastline was a heavily fortified, deeply entrenched nest of highly trained man-portable air defense systems, shoulder-fired heat-seeking missiles operated by IRGC ground teams. And these teams were professional. They possessed the sheer nerve and discipline to hold their fire, waiting patiently in the dark for the massive Warthog to fully commit to its strafing run, before pulling their own triggers. Suddenly, the night erupted. Small arms fire, thousands of rounds of 7.62mm and heavy 12.7mm anti-aircraft tracers reached up from the shore, patterning a deadly glowing web against the A-10's armored belly. The titanium bathtub rang out with the terrifying sound of heavy bullets striking metal. Then a shoulder-fired heat-seeking missile found the massive heat signature of the Warthog's right engine. The impact was deafening. The explosion shredded the turbine blades and instantly started an uncontrolled, raging fire that immediately began feeding furiously on the aircraft's internal hydraulic fluid. Losing flight controls and trailing a massive plume of thick black smoke, the pilot had no choice. He fought the control stick with all his physical strength, desperately keeping the dying aircraft level just long enough to ditch it into the shallow, dark waters near the hostile coast. He survived the violent crash, but within mere minutes, heavily armed Iranian fast boats swarmed the wreckage. Almost instantly, Iranian state television interrupted its broadcast to show grainy night vision images of the sinking Warthog, joyously calling the captured or missing American airmen a precious prize, and publicly placing a massive financial bounty on the heads of any Americans found on their soil. The machinery that the United States military builds is undeniably incredible. It represents the pinnacle of human engineering, aerodynamics, and destructive capability. But ultimately, that machinery is only as good, only as lethal, and only as resilient as the flesh and blood human beings who operate it under the terrifying stress of incoming enemy fire. We are talking about highly trained pilots and weapons systems officers who spent 94 seconds inside a literal blazing hellscape over the Zagros Mountains, desperately balancing the absolute completion of the mission against their own primal instinct for survival. These are operators who have physically felt the agonizing, vision-blurring pull of 9 Gs. These are warriors who have heard the horrifying high-pitched scream of the radar warning receiver telling them that a missile is 3 seconds away from turning them into vapor. These are the men and women who have made the impossible, split-second instinctual decisions that separate a successful escape from becoming a permanent burning fireball on the side of a foreign mountain. If you are listening to this, if you have ever sat strapped inside one of those cockpits, smelling the aviation fuel and the recycled air, if you have a message for the families of the airmen right now who are still missing in the freezing darkness of the Zagros Mountains, or if you simply want to share with the world what it is really like to fly a heavily armed warbird directly into a terrifying gauntlet of surface-to-air missiles, the comment section below is yours. We stand unequivocally with our operators. We stand with the men and women on the tip of the spear. But as the geopolitical world burned, the most dangerous, intensely violent kinetic environment of the entire night was just beginning to unfold on the ground in Iran. It occurred during the frantic, high-stakes search and rescue operation. The United States military operates on a sacred, unbreakable ethos. We never leave a man behind. It does not matter the cost. It does not matter the risk. Within exactly 20 minutes of the F-15E Strike Eagle dropping off the radar scopes, a heavily armed combat search and rescue task force was frantically launched from a forward operating location. Two deeply modified, heavily armored HH-60 Pavehawk helicopters pushed aggressively into the heavily defended Zagros Mountains. These elite pilots were flying in a terrifying profile known as Nap of the Earth. They were screaming through the winding, treacherous mountain passes at 160 miles per hour, flying less than 50 feet above the jagged, unforgiving rocks in absolute total darkness. The pilots were flying entirely on instruments and advanced panoramic night vision goggles, a technology that artificially amplifies ambient starlight, turning the pitch-black lethal mountainsides into a grainy, glowing green world of terrifying shadows and shifting depth perception. As the massive helicopters finally approached the burning wreckage of the F-15E crash site, the IRGC was already there, heavily dug in and waiting for them. This was the trap. The Iranians had expertly turned the crash site into a massive kill zone, proving their brutal tactical ingenuity by purposefully using the downed American Strike Eagle and the blinking survival beacon of the pilot as bait to lure in and destroy the vulnerable recovery fleet. As the first Pavehawk flared to slow down for a hover, the surrounding valley floor absolutely erupted in muzzle flashes. Elite Iranian ground forces opened fire from elevated positions with heavy 12.7mm DS Chake machine guns, their massive armor-piercing rounds tearing through the thin mountain air. Inside the cabin of the Pavehawk, the Air Force pararescue men, the PJs, braced for impact as the airframe absorbed hits. The door gunners hanging out the sides of the helicopter instantly returned fire, squeezing the spades on their mounted 550 caliber GAU-18 machine guns. The massive weapons roared to life, spitting out hundreds of rounds a minute, creating long, glowing, unbroken fingers of lethal red light cutting through the darkness. The devastating kinetic impact of the heavy 50 caliber rounds absolutely shredded the armor of the Iranian technical trucks parked on the valley floor, turning the vehicles into sparking, burning heaps of twisted metal. Suddenly, the lead helicopter was struck. A heavy caliber round violently impacted the primary rotor mast. The resulting mechanical vibration was catastrophic, shaking the massive airframe so violently it threatened to rip the tail boom completely off. Warning lights illuminated the cockpit in blinding red, but the pilot, displaying superhuman calm under fire, fought the wildly bucking controls, aggressively feeding in anti-torque pedals to hold the heavy machine perfectly steady in a low hover. Down in the dirt and the freezing wind, the pararescue men unclipped from their harnesses, leapt from the hovering aircraft into the crossfire, and sprinted toward the rocks. They successfully located the badly injured F-15E pilot, dragging him back to the cabin and extracting him under a relentless, deafening hail of enemy gunfire. But as they lifted off, the grim reality set in. The weapons systems officer's emergency beacon remained completely silent. He was out there alone in the dark. The situation in the air grew even more desperate. The second Pavehawk helicopter was suddenly forced to violently break off its search pattern and dive into a deep canyon to hide. High above them, advanced American A-2X radar planes had just detected two Iranian F-4 Phantom fighter interceptors actively vectoring directly into the rescue area. The aging but heavily armed Phantoms were hunting the slow-moving helicopters, looking to sweep the valley with their cannons. This was the exact moment the F-35I Adder proved its absolute terrifying worth as the supreme apex predator of the modern kill chain. While the rescue helicopters were desperately evading ground fire in the canyons below, the stealth fighters had been quietly loitering at 30,000 feet, virtually invisible to the enemy, observing the entire battle space through their electro-optical targeting systems. The Iranian Phantom pilots had absolutely no idea they were already dead. They were intensely focused on their radar screens, hunting for the low-flying helicopters, completely and blissfully unaware that a fifth-generation stealth predator was cruising 40 miles away with a highly classified perfect firing solution already locked into its weapons computer. The F-35I pilot calmly squeezed the trigger, the internal bay doors snapped open, and the stealth fighter released two AIM-120 AMRAAM air-to-air missiles. The moment they dropped from the bay, their solid rocket motors ignited with blinding fury. The missiles instantly accelerated to Mach 4, flying at over 3,000 miles per hour, covering a mile every single second. They flew silently through the thin atmosphere, using their own internal active radar seekers to independently track the doomed Iranian targets in the final terrifying seconds of flight. The kinetic impact was total and absolute. The first Iranian Phantom interceptor was violently deleted from the night sky in a blinding flash of white light and expanding aviation fuel. Its airframe snapped entirely in half by the proximity detonation. The pilot of the second Phantom, seeing the sudden fiery death of his wingman materialize out of thin air, was paralyzed by the terrifying realization of the invisible death stalking him. He didn't even try to evade. He pulled his ejection handle before the second missile even reached him, violently punching out into the freezing night sky and abandoning his aircraft to be shredded by the incoming AIM-RAM. The sky was temporarily clear. The damaged combat search and rescue helicopters heavily banked away, pushing their throttles to the absolute firewall, desperately racing back toward the safety of the Persian Gulf with the rescued pilot bleeding in the back. But as the sound of the rotor blades faded over the mountains, the grim, heavy reality settled over the American command structure. The young weapons systems officer remained behind. Alone, hunted and trapped deep behind enemy lines in one of the most hostile environments on the planet. The IRGC's highly effective lethal response inside central Iranian airspace proved undeniably that American signals intelligence had suffered a massive, catastrophic failure. While the United States president was standing at a podium in Washington, claiming to the world the complete and total destruction of Iran's integrated air defense systems, Iranian state television was openly mocking these premature claims. They broadcast the footage of the smoldering F-15 crater even as the American strike package was still trying to exit the target zone. The IRGC had successfully utilized a newly developed, incredibly advanced aerospace defense system that had remained completely terrifyingly silent during the initial American ingress. This new system utilized a highly complex, high-frequency tracking logic that completely bypassed traditional stealth filtering and electronic countermeasures. It was a brilliantly executed lethal tactical trap, specifically designed from the ground up to lure the heavy American F-15E Strike Eagles into a high-density, inescapable kill zone in the heart of central Iran. By achieving a hard kinetic lock on a supersonic fighter, they unequivocally proved that the Iranian air defense grid was far from dismantled. It was awake, it was learning, and it was deeply dangerous. The massive B-1 bridge is gone, nothing but a sprawling pile of pulverized concrete and twisted rebar at the bottom of a dark gorge. The oil refineries in Isfahan are burning so fiercely they are altering the local weather patterns. But this mission is absolutely not over. The brutal reality of this massive kinetic engagement is a sobering reminder to the Pentagon and the public alike. The United States military is undeniably the main character in the story of global warfare, but we are not and have never been an invincible one. Every single targeted strike, every severed enemy supply line, every burning hostile refinery, and every tactical victory comes with a deeply human cost. The bridge fell tonight because the American strike package utilized vastly superior computational logic, unparalleled stealth technology, and overwhelming, punishing kinetic force. But American aircraft also fell from the sky tonight because the enemy on the ground is highly competent, heavily armed, and deeply rational. They knew with absolute certainty that they could not stop the incoming stealth strike. It was technologically impossible for them, so instead they brilliantly adapted. They saved their missiles, they hid their radars, and they focused all of their lethal energy on the exit vectors. As the sun begins to rise, casting long bloody shadows over the Middle East, we sit with the full heavy cost of this tactical victory. The focus in the war rooms instantly shifts away from the destruction of concrete infrastructure and the burning of oil and pivots entirely to the desperate ticking clock of human recovery. The fight to break Iran's military capability was successful, but the terrifying, brutal fight for the missing weapons systems officer hiding in the rocks is just beginning. The entire world is watching the massive plumes of black smoke drifting over Tehran. But the men and women of the United States military are watching the silent, glowing telemetry screens mapping the Zagros Mountains, waiting for a single radio click, a single beacon flash in the dark. We brought down the bridge. We cratered their economy. Now we bring our people home, no matter how many sorties it takes, no matter how many stealth fighters have to launch, no matter how much ordnance has to be dropped. Because in the unforgiving, brutal mathematics of modern warfare, the kill chain does not end when the bombs hit the target. The kill chain absolutely does not end until every single American pilot, every single operator, and every single boot is standing safely back on the steel deck of an aircraft carrier.